This will be the start of actually a 2-day series of conversations and discussion. This will be the first one after his lecture. The second one is at noon tomorrow in Cooper House. And then the third one is going to be at 4 o'clock. And particularly the two tomorrow will be very much directed toward the future, toward what this Humanities Institute could become in the next 3 to 5 years. So with that, I'll ask you to welcome Todd to the University of Wyoming and listen to his talk.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to be back in Laramie. One of the things that we discussed a couple of years ago was if we were to have a building for the Institute, what would we call it? And my great idea, which was never adopted because we didn't get the building yet, was to call it the watering hole. And why do I say that? Because it's a place that we go for refreshment, for camaraderie, for conversation. And the reason I say that is that this place has been, for me, over the last 3 years, a watering hole. I've been refreshed, I've been encouraged, my thought has been stimulated by being with you and participating in these conversations, not only about what the humanities are or might be, but to do it in a humanistic way. And Eric mentioned the community that has emerged here. And it's been wonderful to watch from 150 miles down the road, the way in which this community has continued to develop and evolve. And it seems to me that that communal element, that cultural dimension of how we are with one another, is fundamental not only to talking about the humanities, but to being humanistic in what we do. And so it's in that spirit that I'd like to share a few thoughts today about the future of the humanities. And I think in the original title I sent to Eric, it had a question mark at the end, in part because I like question marks, and in part because if it has a question mark at the end of it, it gets me off the hook for having too strong a statement about what I think the humanities might become. So without being too corny about it, let me put this here. Humanities. And this is the corny part. I really do want us to think about the human ties that inform our work as humanists. And to do that, I'll talk a little bit in 3 parts. The lecture's organized into 3 parts. The first is what I call the hunger for meaning. The second is called watering holes. And the third is a vision for the humanities, question mark. But the hunger for meaning, what's the context of the work we do in the humanities? What's the context? It is, I think, a lifelong encounter with these human ties. The ties that bind us to the past, the ties that bind us to each other, the ties that form a coherent personality, and the ties that inexorably also bind us to the imagination of the future. Those multidimensional aspect of the humanities is something that I think we have to keep in focus. But the good news is that the humanities will never go away as long as we have human beings. But the broader context is this, and I think this is one of the reasons that it becomes so difficult to talk in a concrete way about the humanities. We've got K through 12 education, we've got undergraduate education, we've got humanities research, and then we also have lifelong learning, or what we might think about as the outreach to the community. And I will say, I have the privilege of reading Plato and Aristotle and Martin Luther King and Confucius with 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And they are amazing in their ability to engage in that kind of reading, that kind of thinking. They're not going to emerge as Confucian scholars, but they have a sense of what someone else at a different time in a different place thought about the world. They're able to understand that, they're able to wrestle with it, they're able to come to their own opinion about it, and in the course of doing so, their personality is enlarged. And I say their personality, certainly their minds are enlarged, their thoughts are stretched. But their souls are also expanded in quite wonderful ways. As one of my 8th graders put it this last December, he said, "I'm tired of people talking about me as a young person. I'm a person." What a wonderful insight as an 8th grader to have. What a wonderful degree of confidence to take back to the reading that he's doing as part of his normal 8th grade work. What a wonderful insight to have as he goes back to talk to his parents about what would they do if they had been given Gaiji's ring from Plato's Republic, Book 2. The ring, like Frodo's ring, that makes you invisible. And lo and behold, they engage their parents in conversations, and they discover most of their parents would use the ring because they, like 8th graders, want to get away with something. And the next thing you know, you've got a conversation about justice on your hands, about right and wrong. So this level of engagement with the humanities is incredibly significant. And it's obviously tied to this level of engagement with the humanities because these are the people who become our students. Right? So what happens with humanities engagement at the undergraduate level? Too often, it seems to me, and this is one of the downsides of the humanities in its disciplinary expression, is that we end up having undergraduates who are thinking about the humanities primarily in disciplinary terms. So when I was teaching at the University of Denver, I had students who were wonderfully engaged in the honors program in reading Thomas Aquinas and Shakespeare, and then they would go to the English department and they would say, all the fun has gone out of Shakespeare because the aim of the English department is to make me a Shakespeare scholar. So how do we keep that sense of lively engagement with the texts at the same time that we do the necessary work of educating young people in the disciplines that are appropriate to each of our departments? There's the research that we do, which is often seen as disconnected from the real world, whatever that is. And yet it seems to me that this hunger for meaning that I described with the 8th grader, right, is central to our own engagement with the narratives of the past. Right? That mere research is never mere research because it's an exercise in the imagination. The hunger for meaning, how do I make sense out of the world, is also a hunger for memory. Even as we as individuals try to construct a coherent personality, right, that tie that anchors us in ourselves, so too our culture is striving for some articulation, some coherent and adequate articulation of who and what we are as a culture. But the lifelong learning, I was at a meeting in Chicago in November of about 70 organizations, all committed in one way to liberal learning. I would say about a quarter of them were formal academic institutions. About 2/3 of them were organizations committed to lifelong learning, which is to say they were dealing with adults. The others were K through 12 institutions. There's a huge, huge hunger among adults, some of whom have had humanities education formally, some of whom haven't. There's a huge hunger for this engagement with what we broadly call the humanities. And so while we'll tend to focus primarily on these two things here in this context, it seems to me important that we bear in mind the broader context in which the humanities have meaning and have weight. And one of the challenges, I think, for us as humanists in the coming years is to figure out how these things fit together, because the real impact of the humanities is opportunities to come back to the watering holes, to be nourished, to be refreshed. And it occurred to me as I was thinking about the integration of these things that the medieval monasteries in Europe were placed one day's walk apart, so that you could walk as you were on your pilgrimage. You could walk from monastery to monastery. You could put up for the night in shelter, dry bed, and you would have some food. These were places of refreshment. How do we as humanists, whether we're talking about the K through 12 level, the university level, or the countless public humanities organizations, how do we think about placing ourselves in respect to one another so that we're simply a day apart on life's journey? How do we keep ourselves nourished? How do we emphasize these human ties? But things are even more complicated because our engagement with the humanities happens at an individual level, right? There's something ineffable about our own engagement with the humanities, the self-understanding that we develop in reading what we read and thinking about what we think about, right? So this is the inward dimension. But there's also then an institutional dimension. For most of us, that's the university. For others, it's a K through 12 school. It could be the Great Books Foundation or some of these other lifelong learning courses. So there's an outward dimension as well. And then finally, there's the social dimension, which I'll just call the collective in some sense or another. In the end, I think what we all want, what we would all see as a mark of success, is a social culture in which some engagement of the humanities was commonplace, not common, but common to us all. The last complication is that it seems to me that the humanities are content. Right? We have Shakespeare, or we have American studies, or we have music history. Right? There's a specific content. I think one of the things that we struggled with a couple of years ago and managed to get through fairly quickly is a definition that was capacious enough to take in departments and disciplines that had an intersection with the humanities without necessarily being formally part of the college. But there is a content. There's also a process, which is to say that when we engage with a certain content, we do it in a humanistic way. So my degree is in social sciences, nominally speaking, but since it's at the University of Chicago, it could be absolutely anything. And I spent a lot of time with people in political science departments. 98% of political scientists would not classify themselves as humanists, but the 2% who would, right, engage in thinking about political life in a humanistic way. So there can be a humanistic process that doesn't necessarily square with the content divisions that we have in disciplines. But then thirdly, it seems to me that there's also an understanding of the humanities in terms of place, which is to say that a place like WIHR is a place where the different voices in the humanities can come together and bring their disciplinary expertise to bear, but not in a competitive way, but as the assimilation of diverse voices in conversation, right? That is, in some sense, a mixture of the content and the process. So an Institute for Humanities is a clearinghouse, as it were, of the specialized knowledge. So if we did the math on this, we would see all of the different permutations in which we could begin to talk about the humanities. And I leave this as a kind of clarifying framework, not a determinative one, but one that I hope maps out the complexity of the challenge that we have in thinking about what the humanities mean in the 21st century. But let me come back to what I'll call our perennial predicament with the hunger for meaning. And it seems to me that there are three questions that simply won't go away. The first question is, what is best for us? Or we could rephrase it slightly, what should we value? Right? It's a variation on the Socratic question, what's the good life for human beings? But it seems to me that this question, what is best for us, is eminently present to each one of us. Secondly, how do I, or how do we, make decisions? How do I or we make decisions? And then thirdly, what binds us together? What are these ties that make us more human rather than less? And let me lean on this last question for a second, because it arose in a specific place and a specific time in this formulation. I was in Spain a couple of years ago after one of the many austerity impositions, as they see it, from Germany. And one of our seminar participants, a retired diplomat, said in a fairly impassioned voice, he said, "Here in Spain, now that the money has run out, what binds us together? Now that the money has run out, what binds us together?" And let me give you a potted history as to how I think that question arose. We understood in the era of totalitarian ideologies and conflict that values mattered, that our conception of the world mattered, the framework that we brought to thinking about these questions, what's good for us and how do we make decisions, had a real significance, that ideas had consequences. At a certain point, at the end of the Cold War, we lost that tension. Here in the United States, we were also in the middle of the culture wars. We had tired of them for obvious reasons. The one thing that we could all agree on in the 1990s was that it was better to be more prosperous than less. Right? It was the economy stupid after all. And yet, this question from Spain, and the narrative there is slightly different in the transition from Franco-totalitarianism, that the Spanish had had a really good ride economically, but that in the end, economic prosperity was not enough to bind a people together in some kind of community. So the practical consequences of not having something beyond economic values to bind us together, to have human ties as distinct from simply procedural or economic ties, is really significant. So that's our predicament, it seems to me. And that's why I think the humanities have a really good future ahead of them. It seems to me that one of the things that we do too often in the humanities is that we have one foot in the past and one foot in the future, but we lean pretty heavily on that foot in the past. And we're often a little more defensive about that than I think we need to be. And part of what I'd like to do today and in our discussion afterwards is to see how do we shift that weight so that we're on the foot that's in the present and the future? Or to take a slightly different metaphor, how do we put down firm roots into the past in a way that allows us to grow a strong trunk with ever expansive and inclusive branches? That's part of our challenge. But our engagement with the small things in life, our attempt to make some of them, to make sense of them in the heroic drama that is human living, and the texture of our innermost selves, the color of our highest longings, and the grammar of those selves and longings as they are expressed in a common moral language, seems to me to be our task. Erasmus said that nothing human is alien. Nothing human is alien, which is why trying to put too tight a barriers around content seems to me to be dangerous, and at the same time we have to honor our disciplinary past. So how do we think about those things that cannot be alien because they are human? It seems to me that one of our great tragedies of the last couple of decades, and it's not just the last couple of decades, is the confusion of information with knowledge, and the confusion between knowledge and wisdom. So T.S. Eliot said in his poem, The Rock, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" Are we in the information business? Are we in the knowledge business? Are we in the wisdom business? How we answer that question has profound implications for how we structure our teaching, our departments, our research, the very character of a university. It seems to me that we're in all three, and yet for a lot of good reasons we shy away from the third. And we might talk about why we think that's so. But if we remain rooted in the information and knowledge business exclusively, it seems to me we've undermined the sense of what it means ultimately to make humane decisions. So we need watering holes. And I'll give you stories of two watering holes. One's a short story, one's a slightly longer story. I'll take you first to Weimar in 1919 and the emergence of the Bauhaus movement. Walter Gropius and Herbert Bayer put it this way: what is the Bauhaus? The Bauhaus is the answer to the question, how can the artist be trained to take his place in the machine age? I'll say a couple of things about that in a second, but and I'm by no means an expert in the Bauhaus, but as you know, part of the Bauhaus movement was designed to say, how can we take the possibilities of the machine age, right, industrialization, mass production, how can we take that in the poverty and destruction of post-war Germany and make humane living possible for as many people as possible? So a couple of things, right? How do we take industrialization, which had been dehumanizing in the 19th century, and make it humanizing? And how can we do that for as many people as possible? And it's an echo, before the fact, of what Professor Newfield said a couple of weeks ago, I gather, about the small d democratic character of education. But this was an artistic and architectural and aesthetic movement. But there's something else that I think is really significant. The form of the question, what is the Bauhaus? The Bauhaus is the answer to the question, how can the artist be trained to take his place in the machine age? What would it mean to formulate our conception of the humanities in terms of a question? Or to put it differently, what's the question? What's the big question that we're trying to answer in all of the different kind of engagements of the humanities that we've been talking about? Because we often think about the practical application of the humanities as being a solution to a problem or as an answer to the question. But what if the answer is itself a question? It seems to me that goes to the very heart of what we do as humanists, which is to inquire. The second story is a little longer, and it's a little closer to home in the work that I do at the Aspen Institute. The short story I will tell in regards to the Institute, and then I'll go into some of the intellectual foundations, is that there were three guys in 1948 sitting in the bar of the Hotel Jerome in Aspen, looking at 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And they said, there's a problem with how we're training our leaders. Our leaders are good at making technical decisions, but there's a gap between their technical ability our technical ability as a culture, and our moral ability. The question is not what can we do, but what ought we to do? And the three people who were having this conversation were Robert Hutchins from the University of Chicago, Mortimer Adler, and then Walter Pepke, who was a businessman from Chicago. And they were troubled by a couple of things. One, they saw the specialization of knowledge. How does the legacy of the Bismarckian University actually dissolve these human ties rather than reinforcing them? And of course, Hutchins had in mind his oversight, at least nominal oversight, of the Manhattan Project. And he was horrified that the scientists had not only come up with the bomb, but that the decision makers had used it. Let me take a slightly more contemporary example. I was in seminar about a year ago with people who were involved in medicine, healthcare, medical devices. And one of them said, excuse me, as a young graduate student, he was on the chairlift with one of the most distinguished heart transplant specialists in the world. The heart transplant specialist had transplanted some Italian count's heart, and the Italian count, forever grateful, had given him an annual pass at some swanky ski resort. This was a good gig to have. And he was riding on this chairlift with this distinguished transplant surgeon. And the transplant surgeon said, "We're only a few years of being able to breed headless people for organ transplants." And at this point, the guy, the young graduate student, said, "I wasn't sure if I should jump off the chairlift or engage him in conversation." And he said, mustering up the courage that a graduate student needs to have in talking with a distinguished person, he said, "Well, do you think that's the right thing to do?" And the transplant surgeon said, "I'm a scientist. I'm only interested in what is possible. I'll leave it to the ethics people to sort out." Now, I don't mean that as a story to pick on the scientists, because I think each one of us, in one way or another, because of our loyalty to our specialization, outsources a lot of stuff that we think we can outsource, when in reality, as complete human beings, we need to be able to wrestle with those questions. So they were concerned about specialization, but they were also concerned about decision-making. Right? What were the principles of decision-making? Was it simply a matter of greater productivity, or was there a vision of human life, of mind, body, and spirit, that was being lost in mid-20th century? So enter the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset. In 1949, Walter Pepke and Hutchins invited Ortega and Albert Schweitzer to come to Aspen to celebrate the bicentennial of Wolfgang von Goethe. And they took Goethe as their poster child for the humanities, someone who could combine an interest in natural science with poetry and music and the arts, literature, someone who was himself involved in public service and decision-making. And Ortega was second in name recognition only to Albert Schweitzer, whom they persuaded to come to Aspen because they said it was just a short train ride from Chicago, which he had heard of. So Ortega comes, and he's writing his lecture on the boat over. And he has a wonderful lecture on Goethe. That one, as far as I can tell, does not survive. But he was so bowled over by his experience in this silver mining town that wasn't what it is today, that he wrote a second lecture. And he says, because life is essentially that which cannot be repeated, I'm not going to repeat my lecture. And he writes a new one, in which he says that Europe, the European vitality is spent because European culture is engaged in the act of self-repetition. Whereas America has a vitality and a passion for things that are new. Now, one of the things Ortega identifies with modern culture is the figure of Faust. He says Faust is the person, he is the quintessential modern person whose life is bent on repetition. And Ortega contrasts that, not surprisingly, with the figure of Don Quixote. And if we wanted to oversimplify this tension, we could say that Faust is the modern scientific, that's unfair, the modern technical mentality. And Quixote is the pre-modern humanistic mentality. Now, we could have another seminar entirely about what the appropriate reading of the figure of Quixote is. And I gather one of the research projects held just such a conference about a year ago here. But Ortega says, Faust's repetition is an abdication of the basic reality of our life. Life is always my life. Life precedes knowing and discovering what life is. The experience of life is a road, so to speak, he says, which progresses unrolling on itself, that is to say, on us. We are simultaneously traveler, highway, and baggage. What a wonderful image. If you've ever driven over Independence Pass into Aspen, you know just what a treacherous voyage that is. But the reason I mention that here is that we have a bit of a problem. Right? If you take Gödel's theorem seriously, right, there is never any exterior point where we can stand and judge this life that is our own. Right? We're already embedded in the activity of examining our life and the ties that bind us, whether we like it or not. So it raises the question, where do we go to meditate on the experience of life? And Ortega had already suggested in the Revolt of the Masses that modern life is acted out on an ever-diminishing stage. He mentions the drama of life and meditates on what he calls the struggle to achieve being that which one has to be. And too often we avoid ourselves, it seems to me, because we fill our lives, as Ortega says, with the system of our occupations, the serious ones as well as the frivolous ones. Where do we go to clash, he says, with the difficulty of being? Where do we go to realize the gift of life that we have been given? Where do we discover or rediscover ourselves as the problems that we are to ourselves? Where do we test what he calls the root of our human existence, which is the consciousness of uncertainty? These questions are, of course, present with us always, but it seems to me that they're especially acute almost 100 years later as we look at the uncertainty of our own age. Ortega's elliptical answer in his Goethe lecture in Aspen is not to invoke the past, is to invoke the past not as repetition, but as possibility. He says, and since we discover the past through our shock and rebound against the future, there is a correlation between the two, and a way of feeling the future has a correspondence with our way of feeling the past. The past, including within itself the present, is the sole weapon we hold in the battle we are to wage against the future. For that reason, should we ask ourselves, how does the past appear to a man whose future is the most problematical which the human species has ever confronted? Where do we go for that kind of meditation? Not the university, says Ortega. He says the university is not well equipped to deal with those questions because the specialization of the disciplines has narrowed the field of vision so much that the integration of the specialization, the various specializations, has receded. Which is to say, It could happen in a university, but only a university that has places, like WIHR has become, where those voices of the different specializations can come together. Interestingly enough, Ortega says, Aspen's the perfect place to do this. I would suggest that had he come to Laramie, Wyoming, he would have recognized that Laramie is also the perfect place to do this. Why? He said, you need to combine what he called the Athenian virtues of intellectual engagement with Spartan self-denial. And the rugged peaks and cold winters of Aspen were just such a place where one could be detached from the superficial luxuries of life and get down to the hard pan of thinking about the life that we were going to lead. And having driven up through 75-mile-an-hour winds, I can attest that the high plains of Wyoming are just such a place. But he goes on to say that this Attic or Spartan side allows for the art of living to consist in availing oneself of all possible circumstances. And then he says this, the industrial technique of the United States has flooded the market with wonderful objects, which have yielded an excess of comfort. This is 1949, by the way. We should certainly be free from material hindrances, he says, if we are to devote our inner selves to live intensely and to give ourselves fully to thinking, imagining, loving, and feeling. But in the excess of comfort, he insists, we give our inwardness to our comfort rather than to ourselves. Ortega's further remarks perhaps carry more conviction to our own ears than to the audience of the day. And I quote again, I think I could be understood if I say that in my opinion, the American handles too many objects. The circle of his personal life is too much taken up by implements, devices, gadgets. During my trip to the States, I had the impression that the American runs the risk of getting lost in objects, of living on and in objects. Enough said. So this tension between what he calls austerity and elegance is what he hopes for in what he goes on to then call an Institute for Humanistic Studies. And when in August, after this great Festival of Ideas, original Festival of Ideas in Aspen in 1949, Walter Pepke writes to Ortega in Madrid and says, wow, that was great, that was fun, we should do it again, and don't laugh at me, but we're thinking of starting Aspen University. Ortega writes back and says, that's not funny at all, it's a great idea, except you don't want to call it Aspen University, because disciplines have this Darwinian urge to self-preservation, which flies in the face of what really constitutes a humanistic engagement with life. You want to have what I started last year, an Institute for Humanistic Studies. And so, true to form, in December of 1949, Aspen University was incorporated. And then later in December, it was reincorporated as the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. And it seems to me that that's one of the great challenges that we face. How do we, particularly in a university setting, maintain the rich tradition, the wonderful depth of knowledge that our specializations have developed? How do we maintain that on the one hand, and at the same time cultivate a space where that specialization can be broadened rather than narrowed? How do we build the ties among the different fields that we formally call the humanities? And why, and this is where the story of Ortega ends, why is this so important? Ortega famously says, I am I plus my circumstance, and if I do not save it, I cannot save myself. I am I and my circumstance. If I do not save it, I cannot save myself. Right? We're inextricably bound in this social and institutional dimension of what we do. And so often we think about the ways in which we want to have demonstrable impact. and we should continue to think about that. But it seems to me that the real impact in the long run is having more people who live humanistically, right, who are engaging in decisions that take in the full breadth of what it means to be human. Or to quote another author from Our Parts, one of my favorite, Willa Cather, in Death Comes for the Archbishop, which is still one of those books that I can't reread without crying at the end. Spoiler alert, the Archbishop dies. She says, miracles are a refinement of our perception. Miracles are a refinement of our perception. How do we think about the ways in which we collectively refine our perceptions so that we can live, we can decide, we can love in a more rather than less humanistic way? So these watering holes are important, whatever we call them, institutes for humanistic studies, universities, foundations, and so forth. We need to think about how to connect them so that more people have that deep experience. And that may mean, as we think about the cult of efficiency and what Saul Bellow called, again in the 1950s, the great noise that crowds out the clarity of silence. How do we think about these watering holes as interludes? Or to put it in a slightly more crass way, right, the university emerged precisely as an inefficient interlude, a place of respite, of refreshment, a place set apart for that human engagement. And so I do think, rather than speaking purely about the humanities as an abstract noun, I'm more and more inclined against abstract nouns. We should talk in the adverbial or adjectival sense. What does it mean to do something humanistically, or to be an institute for humanistic studies? And we need, in particular, to get away from three errors. The first, what someone recently called the 1930s version of the humanities, which is, the white starched shirt with the black tie, the very stodgy vision of the humanities, right? One that's elite and exclusive. And remember, by the way, the Great Books movement, which had plenty of problems, right, was designed for the masses. How do we think about a new Bauhaus, for example, that would take the best of humanistic thinking and extend it to the broadest number of people? And I can tell you, you don't need a bachelor's degree to read Mencius or Hobbes, because I do it all the time with 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Right? I read Hannah Arendt with rap poets from the South Side of Chicago. Right? There is nothing elitist or exclusive about the kind of work that we do. And yet, we've been branded as humanists, as these stuffy, backward-looking types. Secondly, I think we need to do what we can to forestall the notion that we're overly intellectual, right? That the purpose of what we do is to breed little mini Shakespeare scholars. I'm picking on Shakespeare. I'm in the English department. I don't mean to do that. I love you.
It's all right. You can take.
Right, there's plenty of time to master Shakespeare scholarship. How do we make sure that the text comes alive in ways that are responsible to our chosen fields and yet also engaging for this activity of living? But I think the other thing, and I see this in the work that I do with executives a great deal, because in our academic integrity, we emphasize the intellectual, we've separated off the intellectual from the world of feeling. Which is to say, Shakespeare hits us here to be sure, but it hits us here and it hits us here, right? And these are all three. I did that once in elementary school, and I was told that I would never be invited back again because I made that gesture. Right? So much of what we do as academics lives here, even though we feel it here, and yet our academic spaces are spaces that typically distrust what happens here. I won't say anything else about what goes on below the belt. And then that's related to the third point, the third worry I have, and that is that we often trade off between mastery and inquiry, which is to say that very often getting the right question is more important than getting the right answer, and yet so much of what we do presupposes a mastery of the right answer. So let me share this. This is a statement from the Aspen Institute board report of 1972. I've already given the punchline away. The Aspen Institute starts from an active faith in the humanistic tradition. One must be reflective in order to ensure that all human activity, political, scientific, economic, intellectual, or artistic, will serve the needs of human beings and enrich and deepen their lives. The Institute believes in the value both of the great ideas of the past as well as the importance of the sometimes inelegant and highly controversial ideas of the present. The Institute is dedicated to the fundamental educational value of dialogue for mature men and women from different nations and cultures. Intercommunication between people of comparable competence from various backgrounds and specialized fields of experience. The Aspen idea recognizes that the processes by which persons learn and develop or change their ideas are not mechanical or even purely rational. As there is a mystery at the edge of human thought, so there is a magic about human relationships, and the magic we attempt to invoke in Aspen is that of the sheer beauty of this area of the Rocky Mountains. With Erasmus, we hold that nothing human is alien to the inquiring purposes of the Aspen Institute. The Institute intends to be, in sum, a place of excellence and excitement where men and women of the finest qualities of mind and spirit from all walks of life in the United States and abroad can meet to learn from one another through serious discussion of and work on significant problems facing society and the greatest ideas which have been expressed throughout history and today concerning those problems. I read that not to tell you about the Aspen Institute, but it seems to me that you could replace the Aspen Institute with an Institute for Humanistic Studies and get a lot of mileage out of it. So how do we clarify for ourselves what that vision is for the 21st century? A couple of notes in closing. It seems to me that we have before us the challenge to develop prospects for a global humanism. What does that mean? I've just been reading the Pankan Tantra by Vishnu Sarma, and I am not an expert in this literature. But I raise it for this reason. There are 200 versions extant of this text in 50 languages. It's an oral history written down. It emerged in Persia around 570, according to our calendar. The first German edition was in 1483, which is to say it was one of the first books published after the invention of the printing press. And it was one of the most widely distributed books in Europe after the invention of the printing press. And I had never heard of it until a couple of years ago. And if you were to read it, you would think that it's a combination of 1001 Nights, Hobbes, Machiavelli, Aristotle, Rousseau, right? It's all there, told in these wonderful tales. Right? There is a humanistic tradition that is not our own. how do we think of engaging it in what is inexorably a globalizing world? And that gets us to these questions of community and culture with which we began. And so I'll borrow here from Mario Vargas Llosa, who says this, truly, and I'll read the extended excerpt, I apologize. Truly dependent and emancipated cultures do not actually exist in the real world. There are poor cultures and rich ones, archaic and modern, weak and powerful, but we are all unavoidably interdependent. This has always been true, and even more nowadays, since the extraordinary advance of communications has broken down barriers between nations and made all peoples immediate simultaneous co-participants in the present. No culture has originated, developed, and reached its prime without both feeding on and nourishing other cultures in a continuous process of give and take, reciprocal influences, and miscegenation. The notions of indigenous and alien cultures are dubious, not to say absurd, and it would be extremely difficult to determine what corresponds to each one. In the only area where these terms have meaning, that of language, it is nevertheless impossible to align linguistic groups with the specific geographic and political borders of a country, or to use those groups as a way to set a boundary for cultural nationalism. A country strengthens and develops its culture by opening its doors and windows wide to all intellectual, scientific, and artistic currents, encouraging the free flow of ideas regardless of their origin, so that the native tradition and experiences are constantly tested and corrected, completed and enriched by those who in other lands, with other languages and under different circumstances, share with us the miseries and grandeurs of the human adventure. Subjecting ourselves to that continual challenge and encouragement is the only way that our culture will become authentic, contemporary, and creative, and the best tool for our economic and social progress. Condemning cultural nationalism for atrophying the spiritual life of a country does not in any way mean scorning national or regional traditions or modes of behavior, or denying that these serve even in a primordial way the country's thinkers, artists, technicians, and researchers in their work. It simply means demanding in the realm of culture the same liberty and pluralism that should be found in the politics and economics of a democratic society. The more diverse cultural life is, the richer it is, and the freer and more intense the exchange and rivalry of ideas at its center. It seems to me that as humanists, we need to be reaching out with those broader branches that I mentioned earlier, even as we put down deep roots in our local culture. But what is that going to look like? I was making a similar point in Washington last month at a conference of university presidents and deans. We had a woman from Saudi Arabia there who was absolutely mortified that there was a crisis of the humanities in the United States. And she said to the group assembled, which was a very distinguished group, "We think you have all of this figured out. And we want you to bring the humanism that you've developed here to us." And I think our response to that has to be, we have a tradition that will be enriched by a genuine engagement with your tradition, which is to say, if we have a place where those two traditions can begin to come together, and we have at least some common disposition or mode of engagement, so that we can have the hard-hitting conversation that allows that to happen. So I've talked long enough, but let me finish with Albert Camus. Perhaps the easiest way of making a town's acquaintance, he says, is to ascertain how the people in it work, how they love, and how they die. In our little town, is this, one wonders, an effect of the climate? All three are done on much the same lines and with the same feverish yet casual air. The truth is that everyone is bored and devotes himself to cultivating habits. Our citizens work hard, but solely with the object of getting rich. Their chief interest is in commerce. Their chief aim in life is, as they call it, doing business. Naturally, they don't eschew such simpler pleasures as lovemaking, sea bathing, going to the pictures. But very sensibly, they reserve these pastimes for Saturday afternoons and Sundays and employ the rest of the week in making money as much as possible. Here, as elsewhere, for lack of time and thinking, people have to love one another without knowing much about it. Our town seems to be a town without intimations, in other words, completely modern. The challenge I think we have for the 21st century is how to reinfuse the humanism of life and love into a world that is bored and distracted. Making that connection, reestablishing those human ties, is not simply an academic imperative. It's an imperative of the intimations and imagination of who we can become as fully developed human beings. Thank you for the work that you've already brought to that with the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, and thank you for your attention. And I hope now we have enough to talk about, because the real question is, how do we reimagine what that looks like in this place and at this time? Thanks.